In this hour, and President Bush has called on all nations to help the Burmese people reclaim their freedom. He was speaking at the UN General Assembly as the biggest anti-government protests in Burma for 20 years continued today, despite threats from the military regime. President Bush announced that he will tighten sanctions.
The regime is holding more than 1,000 political prisoners, including Aung San Suu Kyi, whose party was elected overwhelmingly by the Burmese people in 1990. The ruling junta remains unyielding, yet the people's desire for freedom is unmistakable. This morning I'm announcing a series of steps to help bring peaceful change to Burma. The United States will tighten economic sanctions on the leaders of the regime and their financial backers. We will impose an expanded visa ban on those responsible for the most egregious violations of human rights, as well as their family members. We will continue to support the efforts of humanitarian groups working to alleviate suffering in Burma. And I urge the United Nations and all nations to use their diplomatic and economic leverage to help the Burmese people reclaim their freedom.
So what initially sparked these protests? When the regime increased fuel prices by a massive 500% in the middle of last month, suddenly the majority of people who live off less than $1 a day couldn't afford their bus fare to work or essential commodities like rice. Spontaneous protests erupted across the country, and the regime responded with a brutal crackdown. Many were arrested, and the militia was used to intimidate others. But the people persisted, and this was when the monks joined the protest. Their involvement is highly significant in a deeply religious country like Burma. The monks are now refusing to accept arms from the generals or members of the militia, and this is the most severe punishment in Buddhism, the equivalent of a Christian being excommunicated. So it's a potentially powerful weapon in the struggle. As armed police bear down on the protesters, campaign groups say the international community needs to act now to prevent a massacre.
We can't just depend on China using its influence behind the scenes. We need to do everything we can to support those people risking their lives on the streets of Burma today, whether that's multilateral action, unilateral action, pressuring China to use its influence more. But at the moment, certainly the international community seems to be standing on the sidelines and watching Burma slip towards this possible massacre and taking no real action.
Well, we're joined now from Oxford by Burmese research fellow at the university, Dr. Zarni. Thanks for joining us, Dr. Zarni. Are you encouraged, at least by President Bush's words today, that he's going to tighten some of those sanctions the US already has in place?
Well, I'm of course heartened by the President Bush expressing his moral support for the Burmese people. But I think I want to sound a cautionary note here, because I think this is not the time to encourage Burmese to rise up, because the West has very little leverage over the regime, which is supported by China, India, and all Burma's Asian neighbors. And I think like what we should be looking for is some kind of concerted international mediation effort, because like nobody, including the junta, doesn't seem to want the repeat of 1988 national tragedy where 3,000 Burmese were gunned down on the streets. So what we should be saying to the junta is, look, the international community wants to help mediate this conflict, not to help escalate. But I think President Bush's speech at the United Nations is just simply putting fuel into the Burmese conflict. And we have seen this type of pro-democracy rhetoric inciting rebellion in the Kurds area under Saddam Hussein. We've seen this in 1956 in Hungary. And so I think what we need is to find some kind of international mediation efforts to help de-escalate and defuse the conflict in Burma.
Do you think the junta will be open to suggestions, perhaps from this envoy coming from the United Nations later on this month, to look at ways, explore ways of avoiding the massacre that people, or the confrontation that people are concerned about?
I think they will be, as long as they don't feel sufficiently threatened by the events of the day that are unfolding on the ground. I think the greatest leverage if we're looking for a country or government or a regional power that has the greatest leverage, that is China. And I think we should be working with the Chinese authorities, making an appeal to the Chinese to help intervene, to help prevent the bloodshed in the country. This is not the time to condemn the regime, but to make sure that every party is looking for a peaceful resolution, not escalate the crisis. This is not Eastern Europe. I don't see how this could lead to the revolutionary changes in our country. Change is going to be slow and painful and evolutionary.
Well, can you see a diplomatic formula whereby agencies like the United Nations or the European Union can communicate with China and bring about that influence from the East to bring calm to Burma? Can you see a formula where that will happen, where everyone saves face?
Well, I think, we have six-party talks along the lines of North Korea disarmament, and I think that's something that should be tried. There are two options that United Nations Security Council has put on the agenda. One is the international conference, and the other one is the six-party talks. But that's for the longer-term or medium-term reform, dialogue, reconciliation purposes. But at the moment, the most important thing is to help both the Burmese junta and the Burmese people to climb down from this extremely potentially explosive situation, and everybody needs to have a face-saving, honorable exit. And I don't see that coming from either Gordon Brown's office or George Bush's White House. And I think that the West should focus on working with the Chinese and the Indians and the ASEAN countries to help defuse the crisis. That's the most immediate challenge that is facing both the Burmese junta and the people, as well as the international community that is concerned about the situation.
Dr. Zarni, thanks very much indeed for talking to us.
ITV has defended one of its talk shows after a